Okay guys, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to go through the actual vertebra with you. So if you look on your sheet, you do have it listed as you have the types of vertebra and then you have the general markings. So the types are all the different kinds, so I'm going to go over that first. And then the general bone markings are things that you would basically find on each individual vertebra, no matter which type it is. So this first one here that has a very small, and we'll find out the names of these in a second, very small body, a very small spinous process, and then you notice that in addition to one big opening, which is where the spinal cord would go, there are openings on each side of it as well. Okay, so this one is your first cervical vertebra, and your first cervical vertebra has a special name. It's called the atlas. So basically think of it as holding up the world, okay? Second one also has a special name. So this one is called the axis. So you can see that it has a special projection bump piece here. So we'll kind of talk about what that is in a minute. Since it is a cervical vertebra, it is your second cervical vertebra. You can tell that because one of the defining characteristics of cervical vertebra is that in addition to the main large opening where the spinal cord goes, you're going to see openings on either side as well. So it still has the two openings on the side as well as the main one in the middle. All right, so that one is the atlas. I'm sorry, the axis, sorry. So, and what I'll kind of show you here is, so the atlas basically sits right on top of the axis, and you can see where that bump is, that part that sticks up. What that does is it allows the atlas to turn or rotate along the axis, which is actually why the axis has that name. So it basically allows you to say no. All right, so it allows you to turn your head side to side. Okay, so we have atlas and axis. Next one is what we would just kind of call a typical cervical vertebra. So that's what we're looking at here, a typical cervical vertebra. So again, we know that it's a cervical one because in addition to the main opening for the spinal cord, we have two additional openings on each side. One thing to kind of note, this section here, which if we compare that to the atlas, you can see that this section here keeps getting bigger and bigger. That's called the body, and basically the body of all of them are going to get bigger as we go further down. Another thing to kind of that we want to be able to do is know what we're looking at. So I'm showing you the top or the superior side of that. If we look at this from the side, you know, how are you going to tell that you're looking at the top or the bottom? So one of the things that you want to do is you want to look at this, which is the spinous process, the part that sticks out in the back. So those are the bumps that you feel going down the middle of your spine, like when you feel your back. So it should make pretty much sense that that's going to sort of angle downwards a little bit. So that means that if I'm looking at this way, that this side is going to be the superior side and this side is going to be the inferior side. Because if I flip this, then that spinous process is actually pointing up, and that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, okay? So typical cervical vertebra. The next one is a thoracic vertebra. So thoracic vertebra, you can see that the body part here is much bigger. We no longer have any types of openings on the sides. So thoracic vertebra do not have those holes that are on the side. They only have the one for the spinal cord. Another thing to kind of note, as the body gets bigger, that hole basically gets smaller because the spinal cord is going to get smaller and smaller as it goes down the full length of the back, okay? Another thing to look at when we look at the spinous process of this, so this part right here, you can see that it angles steeply down. So a lot of times too, I like holding it this way because an easy way to, I think that this sort of looks like an elephant, or some people say a giraffe in terms of when we look at this. So that's a nice easy way to sort of distinguish this as a thoracic vertebra, okay? Next one would be your lumbar vertebra. So again, you can see the body is much bigger because now by the time we get down to your lower back, that vertebral column has to support a lot more weight. So therefore the body is going to be much thicker. We have the opening for our spinal cord. If we hold this sideways so that we can kind of see the angle of the spinous process, what I usually say about these ones is I usually kind of say that this spinous process looks almost like it's been chopped off. Like when we compare that to this one, if we kind of took this one and sort of just cut it like right here or like right there, that's kind of what happens when we look at the lumbar ones. So the lumbar one has a more blunt spinous process to it. So again, lumbar vertebra. The last part of your vertebral column is the sacrum and the coccyx. So when we're looking at this, these are the fused, so there's 5 fused. So if we look at this, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 holes. So in other words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate vertebrae that have been fused together to form the sacrum. And then at the bottom of this, there's basically a line right here, and then there are 4 bones, 1, 2, 3, and then 4, that fuse together to form your coccyx, which is your tailbone. All right, so those are all of the actual types. Now let's go back and talk about the bone markings. So I did mention the body, so I'm just going to pull basically all of these into view here. So when we look at these and we talk about the body, so again, I'll kind of put them in order. So here is our atlas. Here is the axis. And then what I'll do, just so that we kind of see this, is I'm just going to stack them back on top of each other. And then that way we have a little bit more room. Then this one is your typical cervical vertebra. So if we're looking at the body of these, the body of the atlas, very small. The body of the axis actually has this specialized structure. The specialized structure is called the dens. So the dens is the part that sticks up and allows that rotation that gives the axis its name. So it's a specialized type of body on the axis. Then we see this is the body of the cervical, of a typical cervical vertebra. And then if we're looking here, we can compare it size-wise. Here's the body of a typical thoracic vertebra, and then the body of a typical lumbar vertebra, okay? The vertebral foramen is the big hole. So you notice the atlas, where the spinal cord is going to be the thickest as it leaves, so where the brain stem actually meets the spinal cord. So that's why this one's going to be so large. And then we compare that to getting a little bit smaller here on the axis, and then smaller still on a cervical one. And then if we look, the opening here for your thoracic one, vertebral foramen, is going to be smaller. Now this one looks like it's bigger, but really it's a triangular shape. So the reason for that is because the spinal cord actually ends before most of the lumbar vertebra, but then there are wispy fibers that kind of come out from it, so it kind of contains those in that pattern, okay? The spinous process, for our purposes, is always going to be the part that sticks out the back, okay? So if we're looking, starting over again with the atlas, so the atlas looks like it's been cut off, and that makes sense because you don't want something sticking out right at the base of your skull. So the spinous process of the atlas is very small and looks like it's been cut off. It does get bigger when you move down to the axis. So if we look, here's the spinous process of the axis, okay? And then it gets longer still for the other cervical vertebra. So we can kind of see that, and remember, it angles down, but this one doesn't angle down quite as much as when we compare it to. So here's your spinous process of a thoracic vertebra. And if we turn this way, you notice that basically angles almost completely downward, okay? Now let's compare that to the shorter spinous process again of the lumbar vertebra. And again, when we turn this sideways, what we're going to see, so turn it this way for you, what we're going to see is it still angles downward a little bit, but it's much, much shorter, okay? Spinous process. Transverse processes. So go back to the atlas again. So transverse process is going to be the areas that stick out the furthest on the sides. So that's all we need to know it as for all of these. So transverse process, part that sticks out the furthest on the side. So when we look at the axis, it's kind of hard to see it on here. It's easier if we flip it upside down and kind of look. So when we look at it from this view, you can see this sticks out far, that sticks out far. Those would be the transverse processes of the axis. Then here's your typical cervical vertebra. So again, the part that's going to be sticking out the furthest, over here, over here. So on the cervical ones, just think that they're outside of those outer holes is the transverse process. When we look at our thoracic ones, it becomes a little bit easier to tell. These actually have probably the biggest transverse processes, because remember, this is actually where your ribs are going to attach. So these things that jut out to each side, those are the transverse processes. If I hold it so it looks like that elephant or giraffe again, so these things that I guess would be, I don't know if you think of those as the ears, but those are the transverse processes, okay? Now, if we look at the lumbar vertebra, again, pretty easy to determine this too. So we have this over here and this over here as your two transverse processes. Now, on your list, the superior articular process, and then I have the term facet in parentheses afterwards. Facet is going to be a flat surface that will form a joint, and process is something that kind of sticks up or protrudes. So they are technically two different things, but for our purposes, we're going to sort of keep them the same. So when we look at our atlas, the first cervical vertebra, I told you this one before, so now we do actually have to try to look at this sideways to determine. So based on this, we can kind of see that it sort of angles down or slopes down this way a little bit. So that's how I know that this is the top of the atlas. So once I know which side is top and which side is bottom, then it's easy for me to figure out which one is superior and which one is inferior. So the facet is basically this smooth surface. So one of the bone marking terms that you had to know from the skull, the occipital condyle, sat right onto those. And I had told you then that it allows you to say yes. So it allows you to nod your head up and down, okay? So that's the superior articular facet. And then directly underneath it on the inferior side, so when I flip this over, would be the inferior facets. So real easy to kind of like think about. So the superior facet of one is always going to articulate with the inferior facets of the neck. So if this is my axis and the atlas sits on top of it like this, that means that the inferior facets of the atlas will articulate with the superior facets of the axis, okay? So there will be cartilage that kind of goes in between there and kind of keeps things, you know, a little bit flexible in terms of the movement, okay? All right, so since I have the axis in my hands right now, so remember this structure is the dens, and then directly on either side of the dens are going to be the superior facets. This one's easy to tell top from bottom. Then when you look underneath, we're looking for the two flat, smooth surfaces. So that would be this one here and this one here, okay? So then if we look, this is our typical cervical vertebra. So the thing that's a little bit different about these is the facets are actually sort of angled upwards. So if we look at it here, we have facet there, that's what we're looking at, and the inferior one sort of angles the same. So again, you have to remember that these vertebrae are going to stack on top of each other. So this superior one will line up with the inferior one of the one above it in order to do stacking, okay? Then for our thoracic one, so same thing. So these two guys that stick straight up, so you notice those are smooth. Those are going to be the superior facets. And then underneath, if we flip this, you have two grooved out areas here, two flat surfaces. So again, think about these guys stacking on top of each other. So you can kind of tell that the ones that are shaped like the top here would actually fit underneath here on the next one as they stack on top, okay? Last one then is your lumbar. So when we look at our lumbar, same kind of thing. So here, these are completely vertical. So those are the superior facets. And then we would actually have to flip it over upside down. And when we flip it over, we can see there are the inferior facets. And that should be all of the bone marking terms for the vertebra.